here, so I know we just opened it up, so we'll give folks another minute or two to make their way in, and then I will do my little welcome. So you're able to full-time this semester devote your work to research?
Yes, it is nice.
Do you have like a super quick nutshell description that you can share of what you're working on?
So yeah, I mean, I do, and I'll say a little bit of it when I start too. My stuff, even though I sit in a marketing department, sort of is more public policy oriented. And so I think a lot about this actual issue of how we frame messages for things that people know they should do, but don't really want to do, in a way that gets them more engaged with the process. And so I'm doing some work right now around budgeting, and how we think about goal setting in ways that makes people that help people set better goals in various ways. How we think about the content of messages, how much does imagery matter versus text? So really exactly this topic, like how we think about framing various messages. But it's not necessarily just around food choice or sustainability, but around all of these different types of behaviors that you should do.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I think I'm not going to ask you now because maybe it would take a little bit too long, but at some point, maybe at the end, there'll be time to kind of ask how you kind of made your professional way to where you are. I think it's just
yes, that's quite a different, you're right. That's a totally different set of things.
It's a fascinating field that you are in. There's, it's been kind of a really interesting group of speakers we've had so far with really varied backgrounds and how they got to doing what they are, and yeah, so it's been pretty interesting. All right, well, I think I will, so we don't cut ourselves short here, I will do our welcome. I still expect that folks will probably be trickling in, but that is fine. So if that's good with you, now I will do that. All right. So here we go. Welcome to another one of our Green Living Seminar webinars, our virtual presentations. We're glad to have you with us. As always, seeing your names pop up, many familiar names. We're glad you're here, and some new names as well. So welcome. I am Elena Traister. I am a professor at the Massachusetts College of Art, Liberal Arts, MCLA Environmental Studies Department. And so we do these Green Living seminars every spring, and this semester, our seminar is organized around the theme Individual Actions and Environmental Sustainability. These webinars are always free and open to the public. They take place on Wednesdays at 5:30. And if you'd like to see our upcoming presentations and register, you can do that online at www.mcla.edu/greenliving, all one word. And you can also find links to our YouTube channel with our previously recorded webinars there. So those from this year and before. So we expect our presentation today to go for about 40 minutes or so. And then as always, we have a question and answer session at the end. So if you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button that you can press anytime during the presentation. You are welcome to put your question in there. We will get around to addressing those at the end. A quick announcement for next week's presentation. We hope you'll come back next week on Wednesday, March 17th. We have Dr. Christy Manning, Director of Sustainability at Macalester College, will be presenting a lecture titled The Psychology of Sustainable Behavior. So today's presentation on framing messages to make them appealing will be given by Dr. Nell Putnam Farr, Assistant Professor of Marketing at Rice University. And with that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. So I'm not going to get too much into my background, but I guess I should share the connection to the Berkshires, which is that I am also a Williams College grad, and so spent my time out there. And then my parents also spent a fair amount of time living over near Deerfield. And so we've spent a lot of time in that area as well. So it would be nice to be able to see you guys in person and come back to that part of the world, but it's really nice to be here virtually as well. So to tell you a little bit more about sort of my background and how I came into this area, I sit in a marketing department at a business school. I teach here, I teach all of the first year MBA students here at Rice. But the great thing about sitting in a marketing department is that there's a lot of flexibility about what kind of marketing you do. So my work is mostly in the domain of what you might consider public policy. I think about health behaviors, food choice, financial behaviors, all of these things that you know you should do, they're good for you, but that you don't necessarily want to do. And I specifically focus on how language and presentation, what we in marketing call framing, influence the choices that we make. So I think not only about how we can influence those initial choices, but how we can make people really commit to those choices over the long term, how we can make them more satisfied, want to do this again and again. So I'm going to focus my talk today mostly about food choices, as that's the area of my work that has the most to do with sustainability. And I'll give you some general principles, but I'll also show you some examples from work I've done with some really great partners. So one of them is a very large company that feeds their employees really well, but I forgot to check with them before putting it there, so their name's not on the slide. And then I'll talk about some work I did in the Yale dining halls when I was there, and some work I've done more recently with MCURC. And so just for those of you who would be interested in this topic, MCURC is actually a great organization. They do a lot of interesting work using university dining halls as living laboratories for testing their principles, most of which focus on sustainability and health and how we can think about that. So they are committed to what are called the menus of change, which are shown here in graphic form. And so there's principles of healthy, sustainable menus. And there are a lot of them here that focus on more the operation side. And my work is more focused on the choice side. So how we help people to make better decisions in a lot of these areas. And so specifically, I tend to focus on the plant forward aspect, thinking about how we can get people to choose to eat a more plant-based diet. One of the things that we're very clear on is that we want this to be messaged around positive choice, not giving things up. So while you'll see less red meat less often on there, it does not talk about giving up meat entirely. Because one of the important principles of getting people to make these choices is to make it something that they can live with long term and feel good about. So you can also see here that we talk about leading menu messaging around flavor. That's going to be something I come back to a lot. But if you look at these principles, you'll see that many of them relate to influencing people's choices and how we can do a better job of that. And that's a lot of what I'll talk about today. So starting with a way of looking at this issue. So we've known for a long time that people ought to eat more fruits and vegetables. And in 1991, it was kind of sad, you could say, about how few people were actually eating the recommended daily amounts of fruit and vegetables. So you really saw only about 11% of people eating the 5 servings a day that are recommended. So in 1991, there was a big national campaign. It was sponsored by Dole, but supported by the US government and rolled out across the country. Coordinators, programs, messaging all of this around eat 5 a day for better health. And after all of their investment, we did see a significant increase in the number in awareness, in the number of people who said that they knew that they should eat 5 servings a day. But if you want to guess how many people were actually eating the recommended 5 servings a day of fruit and vegetables, sadly, still 11%. So despite all of the work that they've done around messaging, they hadn't really had any impact on people's actual behaviors. And lest you think it was something about the messaging or the specificity of 5 a day, in 2007, they rebranded and they shifted the message to just more matters, so taking away the specific numbers, and it was still 11% in 2015. So I've been trying to find the more recent numbers. They just released them, I think, in 2021 through 2018, so I don't know yet where it is now, but it's still something that we struggle a lot with, how to get people to eat a more plant-based diet, have more fruits and vegetables in their diet. And so what we learned from this is hopefully not that messaging is useless, but we do learn that it's harder than people think. It's hard to do a good job with messaging. And information alone isn't really enough to change people's behavior. Habits are entrenched. This is something that's really incorporated into people's lives already. People don't avoid vegetables because they lack information. They skip them because we aren't messaging them the right way. So part of the challenge is that we're fighting this very entrenched idea that vegetables are healthy and therefore not something that I want to eat. They don't taste as good. And it's very hard to change these beliefs in people. They're based on people's experience. These are based on natural connections that people have in their mind. And so you're sort of working against the very entrenched beliefs that people have. So one way you could think about this is beliefs driving expectations. And so our beliefs really do affect our expectations of products and even our evaluations of what we experience. So I'm showing you here a study. When people were given glasses of wine to taste, they described the white wine using things like honey, lemon, grapefruit, banana. And then they tasted the red wine. They used very different words. They used chicory, coal, plum, clove, things like that. So guess what? Same wine with food coloring. But people perceive it very differently based on their beliefs about how white wine or red wine should taste. And that affects not just that affects what they're looking for and ultimately what they find in that particular product. And some of these can be even more sort of ingrained and subconscious. So when native German speakers were asked to describe a key, they used this very strong, purposeful language, heavy, useful, jagged. When Spanish speakers were asked to do the same, they used much more delicate and attractive language. And so you asked why the difference. Key is a masculine noun in German and a feminine noun in Spanish. And so obviously no one is going to tell you that they see this key as male or female. So you have to dig deeper to understand the inherent beliefs that people have if you want to try to change the expectations and the perceptions that they have. So this is not to say that messages are useless. Messages can drive expectations, but you need to be aware of what the ingoing beliefs are. And messages are most effective when people don't have strong ingoing opinions. So I'm showing you here a lovely display of roasted cauliflower next to a lovely display of roasted Brussels sprouts. It's going to be much easier for me to tell people about the cauliflower than the Brussels sprouts. And that's not because I think the cauliflower will taste better than the Brussels sprouts or the Brussels sprouts are bad, but because people have much stronger beliefs about how the Brussels sprouts should taste. And it's very hard to change those beliefs, especially with just sort of a quick and casual message. For both of these, I'm going to have an easier time convincing you it's healthy than if I showed you a nice big hamburger. So start with the beliefs that people have and try and work with those. Messages aren't just about good or bad. They can also help people to put expectations in context. So I don't know how many times you guys have bought a big, beautiful bag of veggies from the farmer's market or the CSA, only to get it home and discover you have no idea what to do with some of those veggies. Good messaging can help you figure that out. I worked with a group in the CSA, and one of the things that we talked about was inserting recipes into the carts, into the bags, so that people would think about, they would have an idea, they would be provided context and know what to do with these things. So good messaging helps you frame the expectations, helps give you context, and help explain how the product fills a need and what need it should be filling. So what kinds of messages am I talking about? I'll give you a few examples. So this first one is an example of a veggie of the day poster. We used it to try and get people to think about cauliflower in this example when they were in the dining hall. So this is a big poster. We had small table cards next to the veggies, but it's really trying to get people's attention focused on that particular product. We can also think about even things as simple as the name of a dish. So you have a mushroom taco. How attractive is it going to be if you call it a vegetarian mushroom taco? Can we think about naming the dish something better to try and think about getting more people to choose it? Or can you think of an insert into a CSA share the way I mentioned it a moment ago? Something that gives you messaging to help people put something in context. And even things like surveys are messaging tools. It's important that whenever you're communicating with your customers or with the people you're trying to influence, you're thinking about what kind of message you're giving them. Because even something as simple as a survey can really be important in that context. So in each of these cases, what I really want you to think about is that the type of behavior you're trying to influence determines the type of message that you're going to use. Our posters were designed to create awareness. The CSA insert is really designed to help with satisfaction in that consumption experience. So make sure you're giving the right message for that right moment. You also want to think about what kind of expectations people might already have and how you work with those. So we've talked about the beliefs driving the expectations, but there's also outside influence on those expectations. So this is an interesting example because there's research showing that when you tell people, at least in the US, that food is healthy, it makes them think it will be less tasty. But we actually don't know if that's true for sustainability messaging. It's sort of an open question right now. If I tell you that this is a low carbon footprint food, what expectations do you have about how that's going to taste, and what that really means for your life? And so this is an interesting area of research. This is some work that was just done at UCLA, and they found that food with the sustainability label was more likely to be chosen. And so now we're talking to them about doing some follow-up work to see how it affects people's perceptions of the tastiness of the food as well. But we also want to start thinking about, for example, the impact of the green planet versus the impact of the language there. So what does it mean if I just show you a green planet on the food versus saying it's a low carbon footprint choice? How does that affect people's expectations? And I think it's all too easy to just sort of put all of these things in there sometimes and not think about the individual components and what effect those different components of the message have on people's expectations. So the associations that people have when you ask them questions, that also starts to create certain associations in their mind, and when you ask them in a process. So we're very careful about this when we do surveys, for example, to make sure that we're not asking them at a point where we're going to influence their behavior, because even the questions that you ask can influence people's behavior. Okay. So for the rest of my time, I'm going to actually walk through some best practices for creating successful messages and think about what we can do. And I'll break that down into a couple of buckets. So this is what we think of in marketing as a customer funnel, sort of how do you get people's attention? How do you make sure that they understand the message that you're delivering? How do you influence their actual choice? And then how do you think about their satisfaction and getting them to come back and choose again? And we really think of our messages that way. And I want to emphasize that there are different considerations that go into these different stages in the process. So the first of these is, does it get my attention? And I want to make sure that we're emphasizing in a good way, because there's lots of ways of getting attention that aren't necessarily what you want to do. I'm not talking about monkeys, typing in the Super Bowl commercial kind of thing. But it's really about, do I want to learn more? Do I want to know something more about this? Does it get my attention that way? So one way to think about this is to think about a tuna salad. And so I have a tuna salad, and I'm thinking about trying to get people to choose the tuna salad. So when I give you this, I tell you that this dish is called a tuna salad, you have certain expectations in your mind. Good or bad, that's kind of a very generic description. It's kind of vague. So you're not entirely sure what to expect, but you have an idea. I can add a picture to it, and that gives you a much more concrete expectation of what you're getting, which is good because now you really know what you're getting. The expectations have been firmed. Some people may not like that tuna salad. They may say, never mind, I'm going to walk away, but it does help you understand what it is you're getting. Not a lot of room for curiosity, though. You could think, on the other hand, about calling your tuna salad a salad niçoise, which has tuna in it. I wouldn't recommend, if you have something that looks like this picture, that you call it a salad niçoise, because that's going to create some very misaligned expectations. But if your salad actually looks like this, then the image would probably help. And this is something where you've created curiosity. This has got someone's interest in a very good way. So your picture helps promote their curiosity and their interest. So we have this issue here in naming. Do I have a name that creates positive expectations, but does the image help you or hurt you? And a lot of that has to do with what the final product actually is and what expectations you're creating. So then you have this question of, well, what do I do with something like this? I probably shouldn't call it a salad niçoise because it doesn't have the right elements to be called that, and you're misaligned in expectations again. But I don't really want to call it tuna salad either, because that's not going to get people's interest. So we've done some research that suggests that making a cultural or geographic reference would help, given that it's a cold dish. Words that emphasize freshness and seasonality are probably also good. Descriptors that help people think about the texture are good. This seems to have some sesame seeds, some radish. So maybe we think about other foods that would have that and how we could refer to those to give people context. So I don't have an answer for you about what this should be called, but I would want you to think about what inspired the dish. Maybe there's ponzu, or you're thinking of poke or something like that, and how you can work those elements into the name. Because ultimately the goal is to get people curious, interested, in wanting to learn more, wanting to taste it, wanting to create positive associations in that initial encounter. So I'll come back to Brussels sprouts. So I talked about how we did a poster campaign with vegetables in the Yale dining hall. We did three different vegetables. We did Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, and butternut squash. And what we did with these is we actually showed three different posters. So we had Brussels sprouts, These are the 3 Brussels sprouts posters. We had one that was just highlighting the Brussels sprouts, saying that this was the veggie of the day, calling people's attention to it. We had one that highlighted that it was a healthy choice and gave them a health fact about Brussels sprouts. And then we had a did you know poster, where we gave them a fun and perhaps somewhat unusual fact. And these were all true facts that we went and found. I would not have expected Brussels sprouts to light a Christmas tree, but there it is. And so it's interesting because the expectation going into this was that the healthy poster should do the worst, because people have this negative association between health and tastiness. And so interesting that we found is that well, none of them worked on Brussels sprouts, going back to what I said earlier, but where it did work, which was cauliflower, it was quite successful. All 3 messages actually got people to try some of the vegetable. So we did see this nice increase from all 3 messages. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're attractive photos. They were right there. You know, you ought to take vegetables. We're highlighting at that particular moment and making it salient. We actually didn't see the healthy message do any worse than the others. And I think a lot of that has to do with people already expect their vegetables to be healthy. So you're not trying to convince them of something else. This wasn't on a hamburger. This was on vegetables. And so you're reminding them of the fact that vegetables are good for them and they probably ought to take more. What was interesting is that the did you know the fun fact message, while it didn't necessarily do any better in the first round, we actually showed them again, and the fun fact message was the only one that got people's attention the second time around. And so that's what I want you to think about in terms of prompting curiosity, is there's a lot of clutter for people, and you need to think about what kind of message is actually going to break through the clutter. So it's a message that reinforces something they already know, and it's a message that actually gets their attention, prompts their curiosity, makes them feel good about the overall process. And so this issue of feeling good about the overall process is a really important one. So we see a lot of messages like this, where you say, get healthy, take the stairs. And I know I should take the stairs, and where you position this message matters. But are there other ways to think about messages like that? So this is a video that hopefully you guys can hear. So I like this because it actually goes straight. There's no poster, there's no sign telling people to take the stairs. It's entirely about prompting their curiosity. And when you get people to do that on their own, to want to discover something, to want to make a decision for themselves, it tends to be much more powerful than telling them what they ought to do, telling them what they should do. And it's really interesting. I see this in my own house. Sorry, this I couldn't get it to come forward. When I have my children involved in making the vegetables for dinner, they're that much more likely to want to eat them. And that's even more powerful when children get involved in growing the vegetables. My children who think that certain green kale is something that I push on them way too often. When I put kale in the garden, they'll go grab a piece and just start chewing on it. And so we see a lot of this effort in sort of school gardens, where you get the kids involved in growing, because you're making it fun. You're making them involved in the process. You're giving people ownership and making them want to discover more about it. You can also think of this with respect to swap meets. So you're adding a social component, you're making it enjoyable, you're going and getting rid of your stuff, but you're finding things in return, rather than just telling people to get rid of their own stuff. So it works much better to create engagement rather than lecture people and tell them what to do. So second topic is, do I understand it? So I include this question, and there are probably some of you who are wondering why. Obviously, you need to understand the message, but it's remarkable how often marketing messages lose sight of this issue. We get very caught up in the fun and the attention-seeking part that we forget to actually communicate the substance. So as an example of this, so this is a picture of a vegetarian mushroom taco. And there's lots of ways that you could think about naming it. The most obvious and literally informative is to call it a vegetarian mushroom taco. I don't recommend that name because, at least in English, people actually are less likely to choose items that are labeled as vegetarian. So I wouldn't start with that. But even if you just think of it as being called a mushroom taco, it's still a fairly boring, not terribly interesting name, and actually not very informative. It doesn't tell you what's in there. So we tested a whole bunch of names and sort of did a creative exercise coming up with ways that you could think about naming a mushroom taco. So we thought of Big Crunch Taco and Beach Town Taco. These are actually both names that scored very high on ratings of attractiveness and liking. So how much do people like the name? How attractive did they think that name was? But the problem with these names is, as it turns out, people have no idea what they actually mean. And so when you put it on a menu, no one chooses it because they don't understand it. And furthermore, the Big Crunch Taco doesn't seem to actually fit. If you look at what's in the taco itself, mushrooms are kind of hard to get crunchy. And so things like that actually don't fit particularly well with the item. So there were some others like Punchy Portobello, Feel Fresh, that were a little bit better, but still suffered from that same problem. And ultimately what we ended up with for this was a Korean spiced shiitake taco. So it gives you information, but there's a cultural reference that makes it interesting. The spiced gives you a little bit of curiosity. What is this going to taste like? But I know what context to put it in, and it still sounds interesting. That context is really important. People need to know what they're choosing. They need to understand it. And often they need some help figuring that out. So this is a bottle of something called Blossaglog. Now the bottle is definitely eye-catching, but it's opaque, and I have no idea what it is if I just see it as is like this. I need some sort of context in order to understand what it is that I'm supposed to do with this. So glögg is a very popular drink in Sweden around the holidays, and maybe I'm having a holiday party and I want to serve something fun and festive, but I'm still going to hesitate because I don't know what to do with it. So do I serve it in a mug like a warm spiced wine or in a wine glass? Giving people that context of the glass can really help. And what you might find ultimately is that a message like this, while less eye-catching, is actually more effective because it gives me context and helps me understand what I should do. And perhaps even better if you include a recipe for how to make the Blossaglog sangria, something like that. Giving people that information, that context is really important because you can't assume that they will understand the way you do what you're supposed to do with it. So the next piece is, will I choose it? So we talked about, is it attractive and do I understand it? But ultimately, I think that your goal in these sorts of behaviors is to get people to actually choose to engage with the goal. And so in order to think about that, you really need to understand what people's goals are at the time. And so you can think about this. This is two examples of choosing bread. When I'm sitting there at home and I'm thinking about, oh, I need bread, I want to make sure that the bread that I buy has plenty of whole grains. It doesn't have certain ingredients. It's good for me. Those are all things that are important to me when I'm thinking about bread generally. When I'm standing there in the grocery store and trying to pick out a loaf of bread, things like price grab me. I'm in that shopping mode. I'm in a very different mindset. And so I will just grab things based on price. And so you need to understand what information is going to be salient to people at the moment when they're making that choice. What should you put on a menu versus what should you put on an ad? Those are going to be very different things. And how do you reach people to have that maximum influence? When is your message going to be most important to them? One way we see this happen a lot is with things around food waste. So all too often we see signage about food waste posted over near the trash cans. And there's a logic to it. You're targeting the people at the moment when that waste is most salient to them. But there's a problem with it. The problem is that you aren't targeting them at the moment when they can actually do anything about it. By the time I'm standing there at the trash can, I've taken my food, I've chosen what I'm going to eat, and I'm done. I'm not going to go back and figure out some way of dealing with that waste. And so you have to hope that the message is going to last until the next time that they're choosing food, that it's going to be something that continues to be salient and important to them. That's probably not the case. And so you'll have much more, it'll be much more effective if you put waste messages around food waste at the moment when people are actually making the choice. So the behaviors that lead to food being wasted actually occurred when we were serving the food. That's the moment when you need to actually try to influence people. We just did a large scale survey with MCURC asking students about how they made choices and what led to food being wasted. And what we found were that there were two interesting things. One is that while they served themselves more food if they were confident they would like it, they wasted less food when they were confident that they would like it. And so you might think of an intervention about food waste that helps offer people tastes of the food before they serve themselves. So the other thing that we found is that they actually wasted more food if they were uncertain about the food and someone else served them. So there's been a big focus in dining halls to sort of control portion size, make it a particular portion size, and counterproductively in some ways, because that actually means that people are forced to take an entire serving size of something they aren't necessarily sure that they want to eat. And we saw that a lot of waste occurring because of things like that. So you might have to explore, you really have to explore those preceding choices in order to understand where you have the power to influence people. We see the same thing with a lot of things around menus. So I can show you this lovely menu full of salads and try and get you to choose things that have a lot more plants in the choice. But if they're posted right next to the burger station, where I can not only see but smell those burgers, it's going to be really hard to get me to choose that. And so you need to think about, if you want to get people to choose the salad, when do you present them with that information? Sort of take a step back and figure out what the choices leading up to a decision were in order to try and help them change their decision at a point where it's still malleable, where there's still the option to change it. So you also want to think about sort of helping people make decisions that fit with their goals. So I could ask you this question about, who believes that we have responsibility to preserve our natural world for our children and grandchildren? And hopefully many of you sort of look at this and say, well, yes, of course. So the next question is, are you willing to commit right now to eating meat no more than once per week? Can I get you to sort of make the public commitment to the first question in order to increase your commitment to the second question? So if I want that second question, I need to figure out what the goals are in the first one that align with it, and how I can get you to endorse something, preferably publicly, preferably in some way that makes you firmly committed to it. This one's kind of heavy-handed, but we're seeing this now with actually vaccine research. I was talking to someone last week where they're doing a lot more work about asking people about their goals and what's important to them before talking to them about a vaccine. So you say to them, okay, do you want to be able to see your loved ones again? Do you want to be able to see your grandparents? This is the way that you can best protect them. So it's important to understand people's goals and offer them choices that are consistent with their goals, and make sure that their goals are being activated at those important moments. So this is about commitment and consistency. And then lastly, will I choose it again? So not just can you get them to make that choice the one time, but will they come back and choose it over and over again? So you can think of it this way. So this is the one on the left. I did what I was supposed to do. This is this lovely vegan bowl. It tasted delicious. I chose it at lunch, and I feel good about that choice. And now it's 3 p.m. and I still feel good. I have no mid-afternoon slump. I have no desperate search for caffeine. The problem is most people don't link that feeling good in the afternoon back to the choice of having chosen a better lunch. And so one of the things that you need to think about is how you can get people to link their subsequent feelings, their satisfaction, ongoing feelings, to what they chose earlier in the day. And so people will be very quick to link any afternoon hunger to the vegan lunch because they have that ingoing expectation that it's not going to be satisfying. You need to make sure that they're also linking the positive outcomes as well. And so thinking about the one on the right, you also need to make sure that if you call something a Korean spiced shiitake taco, you don't give them something that looks like this. So trying to think about how you can maximize people's satisfaction with the choice they made. The messaging that you use creates the expectations, and the expectations then have a huge effect on actual satisfaction. So get people to set the expectations high in order to get people to choose, But if you don't match the actual performance, the delta is going to create a contrast effect that actually makes the experience seem even worse than it would if you hadn't created the expectation. Going back to the sort of vegan bowl and feeling good in the afternoon, people who promote exercise have actually been doing a better and better job of this, of sort of asking you how you feel several hours after you've worked out, and reminding you that you might be feeling good now because of something you did earlier. So they're creating that reward, that positive feeling, because you might not have been able to do it yourself. A big part of it actually also has to do with habit formation. Habits are difficult to create. They're also difficult to break once they're there. And so we did a big project where we looked at trying to get people to refill their reusable water bottles. And this, like some of the other things I've talked about, has a little bit of an issue. So this is a hydration station where you can refill your bottle. The problem with this is, like the waste messaging, a lot of the time you put the posters above the water station. And so the issue with that is, I have my nice reusable bottle, but by the time I get to the water station, my water bottle may be still back at my desk, and it does me no good to remind me about this reusing my reusable bottle when I'm already at the water station. And this is actually an interesting situation, because with the company where we tested this, almost everybody had a water bottle at their desk, and yet they weren't necessarily thinking of using it. And so we were trying to figure out how to get them to do that. So we did this test where we put the posters either at the hydration stations like this. And so when we did that, we saw a little bit of a boost to people's water consumption. And so this is before the posters, the lighter green is during the posters, and then afterwards is the post. And so there was this moderate increase in how much water people took based on the posters being like this at the water stations. But we decided to look at what happens when you put the posters near their desks, where their water bottles actually are. And what was nice to see there is that not only did we see a much more substantial effect while the posters were being shown, but we also saw that effect endure. And what happened is, you're creating a habit. You're sort of getting people in a habit of grabbing their water bottle when they get up from their desk. And so you want to think about what the ingoing decisions are, but also getting people to feel good. Like, oh, right, I grabbed my water bottle. I enjoyed that. I felt good about it. I drank water during the day. I feel better when I drink water during the day. Can I create those positive associations that really help you to build habits? Okay. So final thoughts. I talked to you guys about beliefs, expectations, and actions. And hopefully it's not just one action, but an ongoing set of actions. Ultimately, that's the most important question. What's the ultimate goal? With my MBA students, we talk about backwards market research, starting with the outcome of interest and working backwards from there to figure out what you need to do to achieve it. And I think that's important for any of these behaviors as well, is to start with the behavior that you want, but figure out what behaviors are earlier than that in the process, so that you can figure out which behavior you have the most power to influence and work on those as well. And so do we want people to try a mushroom taco, or do we want to increase their overall willingness to try a plant-based item? So do you have this issue where I never try the vegetarian item? And so you've hidden the fact that it's a mushroom taco, or you've hidden the mushrooms in the beef. Or do you want people to say, you know what, actually a vegetarian item for lunch sounds pretty good. I want to change their beliefs overall. That's a more challenging thing to do, but something that is possible if you go about it the right way. And then the last piece is really, at one point in this decision process, do you have the most leverage? How do you motivate people at different points? What's going to be most effective depending on where they are in their decision process? And how can you think about maximizing their satisfaction at the end of it as well? And that's what I have.
Thank you very much for that. And so we have come to the Q&A, and so I will invite anyone to enter any questions that they have for our speaker, and maybe just get us started with one question I had from listening so far is, so I'm trying to wrap my mind around thinking about this idea of trying to help people acknowledge their satisfaction, so that this action sort of sticks. And thinking about some of the projects that students in this class, for example, are working on, and where I think a lot of the satisfaction may be sort of more uh, philosophical rather than sort of
Yes.
how are you personally feeling, right?
Moral satisfaction.
Yeah. How do you go about that?
It is a tough issue, but I think what you want to do is sort of that's one of the reasons why you see it often linked to images. So charity messages that have a specific recipient that's benefiting from it. It's one of the challenges with a lot of environmental behaviors is sort of who's benefiting from this and how do we measure any sort of benefit in general. And so the more that you can do to link it to specific outcomes. So one of the things that we did with that hydration is actually say the number of plastic bottles that were not used as a result of that particular intervention. And so thinking about any way that you can sort of quantify and personalize the outcomes in a way that makes it more relatable for people, I think matters a lot, and more directly relatable. So, children in Africa versus children in my city, how do I feel about those two things? And so making it deeply personal to them can really help with that.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think, great, we have a student with a question.
Hi, so we have a question in the chat, which is, does choosing healthy foods like vegetables reduce food wastage? They said this is probably a research question if it isn't already researched.
So does choosing vegetables, sadly, no. And in fact, in some cases, it might actually increase food waste, especially if it's done in the context where you're getting people to choose something that they don't really want to consume. So one of the things we see a lot in research is people focusing on getting people to choose something without measuring how much of it they actually consume. And that becomes problematic because there's often a question of how much of what they've chosen is actually just getting dumped in the trash. And we're trying to do more with measuring the actual consumption because we see that a lot. And trying to make the plant-based dishes more appealing so that you don't have that effect. That's one of the key principles for the menus of change, is actually to make those plant-based dishes not just more appealing from a messaging standpoint, but to work on the actual recipe design and things like that so that you can satisfy goals. It's also something, coming back to this goals issues, that's interesting is a lot of people think I need a certain amount of protein, I need a certain amount of, different components from a nutritional standpoint, and they think that they won't get that from a plant-based diet. And so acknowledging those goals as important to people is an important step in getting them to consume a more plant-based diet so that you can match the types of plant-based offerings you're giving to them with the goals that they have. But no, it doesn't reduce food waste alone. It has to actually taste good.
That makes sense. So I'm also thinking about another student project that is ongoing as part of this class. Is we're going to be trying to create some kind of an incentive to encourage students, anyone on the campus, to use a reusable tote bag rather than single-use kind of a bag. And so I'm wondering if you have, I know that you could do a whole research thing focus on that, but if you have any kind of quick advice, since we're in the planning stages right now, about how to design an effective incentive to encourage people to use reusable bags, if you have any advice.
Yeah, so I think the ones that have been most successful in that area, there's two that I would say I think have been really interesting. One is a company, a grocer, and I forget who it was, that actually gave people door hooks for their reusable tote bags. And it was a nice branding exercise for them, but they encouraged people to put the door hooks on the inside of their door so that as they walked out the door, they saw the tote bag. Because that's a big issue for people, is that they just forget to grab the bags from their house. And that's a lot to me like what we did with the water bottles, getting them early enough in that process. I also think that another one that tends to work really well with these types of behaviors is social proof. And so can you do something that shows a lot of people carrying their tote bags, and really normalizing that behavior and making it seem like that is the standard of behavior that we should expect to see. And so maybe it's something where instead of, there's various ways to signal the normalization of that behavior. So you have to actually ask for a disposable bag very explicitly if you want to have one, and sort of ways to cue that the normal expectation is that you'll have a reusable bag with you. I would shy away from direct incentives like payment and things like that, because they often tend to backfire. If you think, oh, I can just pay for a disposable bag, that actually makes it acceptable to use the disposable bag. I feel like it's okay because I paid for it, and therefore I don't feel as bad about it. So that's an interesting backwards effect there.
That's super helpful. I would have had no idea. So let's see, we are definitely coming to the end here. I think if there's any last minute questions, please add them. I think my last question was really just coming back to something I had asked at the very beginning, which was, do you want to just tell us sort of how you came to this really interesting area of research? It's, yeah.
So I did what many others do and went straight into financial services out of undergrad. And I spent actually 8 years working at a hedge fund, and didn't really know what I wanted to do after that, but decided to go back and get my MBA. And I actually, when I was starting the MBA program, got really interested in residential energy efficiency. And I actually wrote a business plan with some classmates around trying to change energy consumption in rental apartment buildings, which is a difficult area. And we wrote the business plan. We were sort of entering into these business plan competitions, and I realized that I did not want to run a business doing this, but what I was really interested in was this issue of behavior change, and especially how you get people to change sort of sticky behaviors and things that they, as I said, know they should do and don't really want to do. And I hadn't sort of realized up to that point that this was something that you could do from an academic standpoint. And it was nice that I discovered this at a business school, because a business school gives you the flexibility to look at a bunch of different things. So as long as I can teach business classes, I actually have the flexibility to research things in sort of somewhat different subdomains. And so that was how I came here. So I actually began with residential energy efficiency, but sort of quickly pivoted into health behaviors and was doing a lot with exercise. And now just in the last couple of years, I've also added budgeting to that. And so I sort of sit in all of those areas.
Well, thank you. And it does look like, Bobita, do you want to take, we have another couple that came in here.
Yeah, there's another question. Someone asked, has anyone ever tried to create a default vegetarian menu with a meat section? And they also added, with the intention of normalizing the practice of not eating meat.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what I was suggesting with like the ask, you have to go ask for the disposable bag. Similar thing with meat, like the meat has to be something that you ask for, that you add on. And I think the big challenge for people is they really think of meat as the source of protein in a meal. They think of it as the source of satiation. And so you have to give them good, strong alternatives to that. But we've actually, coming back to sort of another plug for MCURC, it's one of the things we've been talking about as a proposal for MCURC, is really looking at sort of taking the stations where people make bowls or where they make pasta dishes and things like that, and adding the meat. And we're seeing that at more and more different locations, that they create this really beautiful main dish, and the meat is almost a garnish to that. So some of the work that I've done with Google Food, they do that, where the meat is a garnish on the main dish, and they're trying to figure out how to do more of that. They have MCURC and a bunch of other organizations have what they call the protein flip, where they're making the meat-based part of the main course a much smaller part of the main course, and so the vegetables are the primary focus of the dish. So I think we're seeing a lot of that, and there's a lot of people who are trying to do good work in that area, especially in terms of menu and recipe development. Just to add, though, I will say, I think it's really a challenge when you talk about trying to get people to give up meat. People don't like this idea of having to give something up, especially not give it up entirely. And so the MCURC principles and a lot of what we do is around lessening meat consumption, not giving it up entirely, because that's a much easier pitch to people and does have a significant effect on their carbon footprint, especially less consumption of beef and lamb.
Yeah. So this is all super relevant to the previous talks and to the projects that we're working on. And I think just with that, I just want to thank you so much, Nell, for joining us. This is a really different way of looking at some of the ideas we've been thinking about. So I really appreciate you sharing with us tonight. Thanks to Abby and Bobita for helping to moderate the discussion. And as always, thanks to our attendees. We hope you'll join us again next week. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, guys.